All right, tonight we are very excited to have with us Dr. Paula Schauer, and I hope I'm presenting that right, Paula, and Pauline Heard-Dunn. Ms. Heard-Dunn is currently an itinerant teacher in the program for the deaf and hard of hearing, our DHOH students. Her teaching career spans 29 years with PGCPS, and she's served in several capacities with the DHOH program, including classroom and resource room teachers at various levels of instruction. Dr. Paula Schauer is also with us, and she joined PGCPS as the instructional specialist for audiology in 2017. And she has over 30 years of experience as a pediatric and educational audiologist and worked for 10 years as a clinical assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. She's a member of both the Department of Special Education Program and Services and the Deaf and Hard of Hearing leadership teams. And she has shared tools to promote student and parent engagement and supported initiatives to promote students' communication skills and accessibility to the curriculum. So ladies, both of you, welcome, and we're excited to have you here. And I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Good evening, everyone. And we look forward to spending this time with you.
Yep. So as was the introduction, I'm Pauline. And yes, I have been working for the Department Program for Deaf and Hard of Hearing for the last 29 years. Currently, I'm an itinerant teacher. For those who might not know what that is, I travel to different schools where our deaf and hard of hearing students are in when they are in their neighborhood schools. I may be there once a week, twice a week, once a month, twice a month. But those are the students who we were going to present on tonight, who are in their general education classroom in their neighborhood school, who just get varying levels of support from Program for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I think speaking for myself, I wanted to present on that topic. I'm sort of new in that area. I've been doing this kind of work for the last 4 years. Prior to that, I was mainly in the high school at the Program for the Deaf and the resource room and self-contained students. And I realized after I started this position that this population is sometimes overlooked. Our program, we spend, usually when you think about deaf or hard of hearing students, you think about those who sign or in special classes, and not a lot of attention, it seems, is given to the ones that are in their neighborhood schools, receiving services from their neighborhood, from their schools, special ed, mainly could be their special ed department with a limited amount of support from the Program of Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So truth be told, they represent the largest number of students that we serve. So just wanted to shed some light, give them a little shine this evening. I think a population that is sometimes overlooked. Would you agree with that, Dr. Schauer?
I'm trying to get back to where we belong on the slide.
Are we handling the PowerPoint? Or was it the IT? I guess I should have asked before they.
Yes, I made you both co-hosts so that you could share. I don't have a copy of the actual slides. I only have the PDF.
Okay. So I have the slides up.
Okay.
So I think the biggest challenge is that we have, as you were indicating, we have a large number of students that are in the mainstream, and our biggest challenge, I think, is working with such diverse schools and school teams. And, you know, we have a diverse population of students, and every student that we work with has individualized needs. And so trying to tailor our services again, to a large population of students with the number of teachers that we have and the number of audiologists.
That's for sure. So tonight we will be focusing on language and literacy development, and how we can support students in their neighborhood schools, what parents can do to help advocate for their students. I'll wait for you to get the PowerPoint up.
So the PowerPoint is up,
Oh,
and
me
we are on the slide, teamwork makes the dream work.
Okay, because I just see you. Hang on.
Yeah, Paula, we're not able to see your slides either.
Oh, what am I doing wrong? If I'm, because I pulled it up from the,
You shared it.
let me hit escape.
Share screen. This is live, y'all.
That's what editing for recordings is all about, right?
Okay, hold on. I know why.
While she's doing that, I thought maybe we could kind of see who's in the room. Maybe are there, if you're a parent, maybe put it in the chat, a P. If you're a teacher, a T. If you're another. Let's see who we have. I see a teacher, a parent, an other, huh? I should have been more specific. School therapist, okay. Interpreter. Thank you, interpreter. Okay, here we go.
Sorry about that.
Just wanted to know who should we gear, like if we had elementary school or who we had in the room.
Okay, now we got it.
My
My apologies.
So students in the neighborhood, in their neighborhood schools, or anybody, you see teamwork makes the dream work. And everybody who works with the student is part of that team. And you'll notice that the student themselves is the first person on the list. The biggest work that I have as an itinerant teacher is helping students become their own best advocate, helping them to learn the strategies that they need, what works best for them, and how to ask for it in the school setting. And so everybody there that the student comes in contact is part of the team. Everybody should know the communication needs of that student, how to best accommodate them. You'll see also the private audiologist as well as the educational audiologist. So that is the private audiologist, of course, is the one who does the actual clinical testing, and they work very closely with our school audiologists in terms of implementing those, what the prescriptions that they recommend. Everybody that, again, that the student, the general ed teacher, the special ed teacher, all the related services, it could be ESOL, the occupational therapist, everybody, and also parents. One of the biggest, most important people on the team, parents. I think you can go ahead.
Okay. All right. So as Pauline was saying, you know, for us, it really takes a team to help to support the students in creating this connection between what is actually happening at home and at school. And the more that we work collaboratively, the greatest opportunity that we have to afford students optimal outcomes as far as developing their communication skills, their social emotional wellness, and really helping them best prepare themselves to be individuals that will be living with hearing loss. And in most cases, our students are going to be living with hearing loss for the rest of their lives. So it's important for us, again, to help support this really solid groundwork for the students, and they have this sense of security within themselves. An example of what can actually happen if we have this disconnect that can occur And so sometimes, for example, we have students that amplification or a primary mode of communication is recommended for the child. An example, sometimes our students require the use of American Sign Language to help support their communication and access to learning. If it's only delivered at school, if it's sign language, or they're only utilizing hearing aids at school and not at home, what can happen is between the time that they are in kindergarten all the way up to high school, when we calculate out how much time that actually comes out to be, it can average about 14% of their lifespan that they've only had access to their use of amplification or that primary mode of communication. So when we look at that in comparison to how individuals with normal hearing function, you know, it's not a situation that when we leave our school or we leave our workday that our communication stops or our hearing stops, you know? So again, it's just really important to keep that in mind. And the more that we have that level of connection between the home and the school, again, we have an opportunity to provide them with better outcomes. And again, looking at across their lifespan as they're in school, and then giving them the best opportunities that we can to keep those doors of opportunity open for them for their career, or if they're going to choose college, again, just to create that level of readiness for them. So one of the things that we do depend on, as Ms. Heard-Dunn was saying, is that we depend on audiologists out in the field to provide us with audiology reports so that we can glean some insight as to what the potential impact a hearing loss may have on a student. So when we're looking at their test results or their audiogram, frequently you'll see us make use of this audiogram of familiar sounds when we are counseling parents and staff within schools so that they have a good understanding of the hearing loss in and of itself and what kind of access to the different speech sounds is really present. So when we look at the audiogram, again, we have low pitches to high pitches across the top. That's also referenced to frequency. And then we also have loudness, which runs from a whisper at the very top of the graph. And as you can see, sounds are getting louder. So the larger the number, okay, that was good. So the larger the number, the louder the sound has to be presented in order for the child to hear that particular frequency or pitch. What ends up happening is that the audiologists are actually recording their response at 50% of the time when they either raise their hand or demonstrate a behavioral response to each individual sound. And then they're going to plot that on this audiogram. You'll see in this shaded area, that's actually called the audiogram of familiar sounds. And I'm so sorry.
Speech banana, the shaded part, the speech banana. Do you have audio or did you lose audio?
Okay, I got it.
Okay.
I had to mute.
Oh.
Okay, sorry. All right, so when we're looking at the shaded area, you'll see that there are the speech sounds that are represented for each of the frequencies, okay? So again, if as an audiologist, when I'm looking at this, I'm not only looking at the degree of hearing loss, which is down this axis. So this is mild in this particular range up here. And then again, as the hearing loss would increase, we get into moderate, moderately severe, severe, and then profound. When we're looking at this, think of this somewhat like a submarine, okay? And so when sound is heard by an individual that has normal hearing, all the sounds are submerged because normal hearing falls in this range at the very top. It's when we have students that have hearing loss, which I'll show you in the next slide. I thought I was. There we go. Okay, and I'll show you in the next slide that here we have, again, I'm showing you 3 different types of audiograms just so that you can see that you'll see different audiograms, but it actually represents the same thing. All right, so here we have lower frequencies rising into the higher frequency sounds. Lower frequency sounds are predominantly those vowel sounds. Higher frequency sounds give you that clarity behind speech, okay? So in this particular case, this individual just has hearing loss in one ear, in the right ear. The circles are the right ear. And you can see that the hearing loss is falling in that moderate range for the most part. And then this is where they put a bone oscillator behind the ear to see, well, is this hearing loss a permanent sensory neural hearing loss? But in this case, we have a difference between the two, and we have a conductive hearing loss. So there's something in the ear, in the ear canal or in the middle ear space that's actually causing this difference between the ears. And you can see that for this particular child in their right ear, that they do not have access to any of the sounds for discrimination of those individual speech sounds. What ends up happening is the child may hear speech, but not be able to discriminate speech in that ear. And we used to think that students with a unilateral hearing loss should be able to survive in school without any kind of difficulty. But we have later found through the use of research that many of these students experience significant difficulty because they lose access to what is called spatial hearing. Spatial hearing is that natural ability to be able to be in a space and you can hear sounds that are in your environment and in different locations that are being presented to you in different environment. And you can kind of figure out, well, where are those sounds? You also have the capacity to really focus in on that primary source of interest when you have high quality of spatial hearing. And you can separate out figure ground, meaning I can focus on that primary source of interest and I can put those background sounds in the background of my brain, and I don't have to really pay attention. I know they're there, but I have the capacity to separate those out, okay? In this next example, we have a similar situation. In this case, we have both right and left ear. That's a bilateral, and it's mild to moderate, pretty much when we're looking at the frequencies that are associated with speech. Okay. And then in the very high frequencies, this particular child has a hearing loss that's tapering off. This child's really going to have a lot of difficulty, even with the use of hearing aids, because S is the most frequently used speech sound in English. So even if we try to amplify it, we can only bring it up so far. And so that's an important factor for us to take into consideration. Well, how much does that impact their speech production of sounds, understanding of words, and what other potential resources can we afford the child in order to increase their accessibility, okay? And then this last example is a severe to profound sensory neural hearing loss. And again, we have these lower frequency sounds into the higher frequency sounds. And we know that this particular child is going to have significant difficulty because they really have no access to speech without the use of amplification. Interestingly enough, I've worked with Ms. Heard-Dunn on a couple cases where we've learned a lot from students that have this severity of hearing loss and the types of amplification and the types of accommodations that the students have benefited from. And you would look at that and you would think, well, even with the use of amplification, they're really, really going to struggle. but some of our students are visual learners and they've become very strong readers. And through distance learning, we've implemented captioning, and it's amazing how captioning has really increased their accessibility and the clarity of their understanding of instruction. And by affording them that, as well as their use of amplification, they've done extremely well. On another type of mode of communication that has been successful for our students, not only captioning, but affording them American Sign Language. So again, we have to look at every individual student, and we can have a student with the same degree of hearing loss, and how they communicate and access is going to be very different. And some of that's associated with their learning styles and who they are and what their personality is. And so there's a lot of factors that we have to take into consideration. And a lot of that we also learn from parents. What are you seeing at home? And as they are going from grade to grade, again, we need parent input on what your observations are at home as to how they are actually communicating and how they're learning, and any difficulties that they're having with their schoolwork from your perspective.
So throughout here, I have put a few questions just to see common misconceptions, myths. So the first one, what percentage of English speech is actually visible on the lips? And you can just put in the chat what you think. Is all of it visible on the lips? Is half of it? What do you think? How much can students rely on speech reading? I'll just give a couple seconds for that. And Dr. Schauer, if you could go back to your slide before, I just wanted to make a couple. One thing that's going to come up in a little bit, you'll see the word deaf. Just looking at these three slides, the one on the right, of course, you see the severe to profound hearing loss. You would call that student deaf, like in a clinical sense, right? And maybe that would be the student that might be learning sign language. And as you said, that might not be the case. We have some students in our program who might be clinically deaf, but function more, use that little bit of residual hearing that they have, and with the visual cues, can really benefit in an oral environment. Somebody like the middle one, you might think is hard of hearing. But if you really looked at the audiogram, even of some of the students in our signing program, their profile might look like that. So you really can't say based on the audiogram per se, how a student is going to communicate best, which mode of communication they might prefer. So I just wanted to make that point. Oh, and the other point I wanted to make, when you talked about the hearing aid, a lot of teachers, especially in the general ed, oh, he put his hearing aids on and now it's like glasses and you're 20/20, you can hear 20/20 the same way you could see 20/20 if you put your glasses on. But hearing aids don't work as like that. I think you said that only about, you can gain, maybe come up halfway from where you are without the hearing aids, maybe halfway up. So they're not a perfect fit. They're not okay, he has his hearing aids on, he's just like everybody else, or the student is just like everybody else. They still have communication needs. They still need those accommodations that are in place. It's not a permanent, or a fix everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Ms. Heard-Dunn is correct. I mean, when we fit children with hearing aids and adults, we can give you about half back. So an example would be, if I look at this particular student here, I can bring them up to maybe about 30, maybe 20, depending on the type of hearing aid. And then again, pretty much bringing that individual right across here. So again, it increases their accessibility, but sometimes they may have some difficulty out in these higher frequencies. So it actually improves your access. It doesn't totally restore normal hearing. And that is really something, and that's a hearing aid, a cochlear implant, a Baha. We can bring you up close to that near normal to borderline normal range at times. And then again, depending on the severity of hearing loss, we can only give half back.
Okay, you can go ahead now. Did we get anything in the chat about what percentage of, I can't see. Okay, nobody wants to play with me. They say 40% actually, right? 40% of English is visible on the lips. So students really need other kind of strategies other than just relying on speech reading to augment their hearing. So I want teachers and parents to know that some people think, oh, he's reading my lips. Yeah, some people have better abilities than others to do that, but certain things that you can do, like these accommodations that are coming, that will aid. Well, you can bring that 40% up to 60 or 70% when the student has a background knowledge of what you're talking about. Okay, so this accommodations modifications checklist, you may have received it when you registered for the class. It was one of the resources we added, but this is a form that we look at. Every modification and accommodation doesn't apply to every student, but when we're making the IEP, when we are thinking about the accommodations for the student, this is a checklist that we use. Some of the accommodations are in the classroom, some are for their listening devices, wearing their hearing aids. Some of it are FM, the assistive devices. It could be closed captioning could be one for when students get to be a little older and their reading skills improve. But this is, you have this resource for you, and it lists a lot of the accommodations that we look for and we try to implement in the IEP. Some are curriculum. If it's a listening activity, of course, we would do something different. Go ahead.
Okay, so, as Ms. Heard-Dunn was saying, we use that list as a tool, as a reminder of things that we should consider for accommodations. But many times we are also looking at perspectives from school team members and the parents. And as the students get older, they can also let us know what is successful for them and what supports are helpful, what supports are not so helpful. And that, again, having feedback from all parties really helps us better define what kinds of supports and services should we be aligning, or what kind of intensity of services are going to be required from maybe a special education teacher, an ESOL teacher, teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing. Again, it's just really important that we put all that into perspective as we align services so that we can develop a student-centered IEP, and the accommodations are extensive enough that, again, the student acquires sufficient support so that we can develop what we refer to as brain hearing. So for the longest time as being an audiologist, we really focused on the hearing loss. And as time has progressed on, there's been greater emphasis in looking at, well, what is the hearing? Because sometimes when we have students that are using ASL, American Sign Language, really can promote their brain hearing. It gives them that better understanding from a cognitive perspective as to what they really should be understanding within the context of a classroom setting. And then also covering that across content areas, math, social studies, science. And again, when we're looking at brain hearing, and I was reflecting on how much time students have access with their use of amplification or that primary mode of communication, brain hearing can be actually impacted if there are any types of limitations or a disconnect between the school and the home setting. Or even if the student chooses, like in their social circles, that they're going to maybe not utilize or doesn't have access to a primary mode of communication in those settings. Again, how can we advance their ability to have this sense of security of self, to make use of whatever is needed to support their communication, and in the context of a school setting, their access to instruction and learning. And we have found over the course of time too, that teaching students about their hearing loss really helps them to better understand what their experiences are, why are they missing certain sounds in their environment, how can I develop my speech and language, communication, what kinds of things do I need to do to help support my brain hearing or my understanding, comprehension of instruction. When we look at that list of accommodations, it really targets what staff does, but we have to get the students to meet us halfway. And the more that they understand what their role and responsibility is in that process, again, the better capacity that we have to develop that brain hearing and their cognitive processing abilities.
Sorry, I was muted. Here's a quote that to me kind of sums up what the experience might be like for students in the mainstream. Mainstream prepares deaf, and you'll notice deaf in quotes, I'll talk about it in a second, prepares deaf children for the real world and enables them to develop necessary skills for communicating, working with hearing people, but can also be lonely. And several different articles I read had a similar quote that actually it's pretty much the same quote. And that kind of just sums it up. Now parents have choice. And so a lot of people choose mainstream for their children. And you can understand why. The curriculum is the same as what everybody else is getting. It prepares them for the real world. They're going to have to, be around hearing people, but it can be lonely. And so one of the ways, we have to also think about their social, emotional well-being, and how we can make it less lonely for them. And you'll notice deaf in quotations. And going back to the audiograms that Dr. Schauer presented, some were hard of hearing, some were deaf. But in this case, it's used more loosely. One of the things we try to do is introduce the deaf community to the children, to our students. We let them know there's a whole deaf community out there, and it's not dependent on what your audiogram looks like. If we ask students, are you deaf? Are you hearing? Are you hard of hearing? Depending on their age, usually around middle school is when they're trying to develop their sense of self and their identity. So kind of just say that to them. We don't want them to feel deaf. Oh, I'm not deaf. I'm, just getting them used to the word and helping them to feel good about themselves. We read stories about deaf people. We, introduce different things about deaf culture. But it's not like it's a bad word to be deaf, and it's not dependent on the amount of hearing that you have per se. And if they don't, identify that way, but we just want them to be exposed to it. Yeah.
Well, and one of the beauties that is actually, as challenging as people have, the challenges that people have experienced with distance learning, one of the benefits that has come out of that whole process is the teachers for the deaf and hard of hearing have been able to pull together Google Classrooms and pull together group sessions so that students from different schools and different ages can meet each other and participate in dialogues about their experiences, challenges that they're having, whether it be at home, socially, at school, and coming up, working collaboratively to come up with some resolutions and have an open dialogue. And I think it's just been really great for the younger kids to see the older kids and again, have some representatives of what my future can be like, and then they can be role models to the younger students. So it's just been really neat, and a lot of the activities have really supported the social emotional wellness of the students while they have been at home during,
that has definitely been the single best thing, I think, of online learning for them, for our students. To really, especially the ones that are in the mainstream, who often are the only person who wears a hearing aid in their whole school, maybe one other, but has really given them a sense of community. And I hope we can find ways when we go back to the building to keep that going. That's what we're in talks about now, how we might be able to do that.
And I think we've been better able to connect with parents and communicate with parents, through the virtual meetings, having more student focus sessions, one-on-one. It's just been amazing what the audiology team has had to do virtually to try to troubleshoot. One colleague used a fork to help remove a tube. Teach a student, the student was using the fork. Not best practice, but it worked. Had to remove the tubing out of an ear mold, and then taught him how to replace it. So again, part of our job is to work with parents to develop the students' self-efficacy, and that means developing their capacity to manage their loss and their equipment and their communication skills, their learning. And then at the same time, build their capacity to self-advocate. So students are reaching out and requesting assistance when needed when they have a need for assistance from a teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing, or an audiologist.
Yep, that's true. School-based audiological rehabilitation. So you'll see 3 categories. Don't worry about trying to read all of that. I will show you each one separately. But there are actually 3 areas that we can look at for students deaf and hard of hearing in mainstream classrooms in terms of maximizing their ability to achieve in mainstream setting. They are the physical environment, also coined classroom chaos, managing the classroom chaos, different strategies for literacy and language development, which is also, we call that FaceTime, and then personal identity and community involvement, or fitting in. And then we'll go through each one of those a little bit more in depth. So in terms of the physical environment, what's important for classroom teachers who have deaf or hard of hearing students in their room, as an itinerant, when I come into the classroom, I'm looking for the acoustics. How does it sound? Usually when the floor is not covered, there's reverberation. You hear, sounds might bounce, and that is really distracting for hearing aids. Where is the student sitting? Is she sitting near the air conditioner that's humming, or the computer that's humming, different things in the room that might have some background noise that we kind of just filter out, but they are very distracting for students who might have on hearing aids or have hearing loss. The lighting is another big one. Where the teacher stands, is there a glare from the light that kind of obstructs the view from her face? Is it, you don't want to be in front of the window that might have the sun glaring in it. So those are the kind of things that will limit the student's ability to maximize, their visual cues that help them with their residual hearing. One thing we learned a lot, I guess we were talking about hearing loss, there is a concept called deaf gain. And one of the ways that deaf people have really helped hearing people is through the use of technology for communication. We were talking about texting. There was a time texting and video phone weren't that popular, but deaf people really took to it. And now it's it's an everyday thing for all of us. They're really good with the interactive whiteboard thing. All these communication devices closed captioning. Now, not only deaf people use it, people learning language, young children, you know, so all these things are, to me, ways that deaf people have added to society. Schools that have, at the high school level, I see it more, the visual alarms for when the bells change, the fire alarms, those kind of things. Let deaf people or hard of hearing know that they are accepted, they are part of the community. The seating, we usually don't have a lot of input on seating, but certainly a U-shaped circle is better for communication to see everybody. And again, we talked about the competing noises, keeping students away from background noises that might distract them from hearing their teachers clearly.
Okay. There was something I was thinking of too. Oh, all right. So we're also looking at classroom chaos. As a student gets older, the more that they understand how their instruments function, if they're wearing a cochlear implant, a BAHA, hearing aids, the more that they understand what they can do potentially on their hearing aids. So for example, some of our students, when they get into middle school and high school, are now acquiring hearing aids that they can have a program button on their hearing aid or cochlear implant or BAHA, or B, they can actually have a connection, a wireless connection to their iPhone or Android, and they can have an app on there that is a remote control feature. So, you know, I can remember working with a high schooler who transitioned into these new hearing aids. And at first she really wasn't wearing her hearing aids very well or consistently. Once she got the new hearing aids and had that level of what we call connectivity and control over her listening environments, because she could adjust them, she would wear them and they would be in this average everyday listening setting. And when she would have a lot of background noise, she could go into a second program and she could minimize the background noise, and then she could better hear anyone who was in close proximity to her. So she really learned how to use that strategic positioning or seating to optimize her listening and the access that she would receive from her hearing aids, even when she shifted to another program. The other thing is that we have students that are using assistive technology that is compatible with their personal devices. And again, teaching the students and helping parents better understand how the equipment is actually functioning and what it can do for them, not just at school, but across their activities of daily living. You know, we've had students that are better able to listen to music, talk on the telephone, watch television, communicate with their family members, and those types of things. And again, the more that we can build that collaborative effort between both home and school, again, the better outcomes that we're going to have and the greater acceptance that they will have. So the particular student I was talking about, she was in high school, and at first she was not going to pursue college. And once she got her new hearing aids and had them for the last 2 years of high school, she then decided to go ahead and transition to the local community college. And she did very well with school, you know, after that, and moved on to a career. So, you know, again, when we work collaboratively and we engage the students and helping them develop not only their use of accommodations and modifications, but optimizing their use of their devices or communication skills, again, greater sense of self, and then they have a better capacity to have all those doors open to them as they graduate from high school.
Strategies. In a nutshell, making communication visual. As much as you can make it visual for our students, it is the better. In school, the visual to verbalize is an actual reading program, but for deaf and hard of hearing students, everything, the words and new vocabulary, new concepts, having those written out usually before you're going to use it in school, because if they're relying on lip reading to enhance their speech, their listening, they would have to have seen those words or have, some kind of familiarity with it before. So giving out notes in advance, handouts in advance, that really helps our students follow along, especially in the upper grades, middle school and high school. Class presentations or discussions is usually a time that our students kind of fall behind. They're sometimes able to keep up with the teacher when she's speaking, but when everybody starts speaking at the same time or one after the other, trying to keep up with the conversation, that is when a lot of our students really fall behind. So as a teacher or even at home, if we can kind of monitor that rate, maybe reiterate what one person said, repeat it back, point to somebody who before they get ready to speak, so the student will know where the sound is coming from. All those ways, getting the student involved, engaged, asking them their opinion, get them involved, so they're, it's not always I'm trying to catch up. Really have to slow it down so that they can be a part of the conversation. Yeah, I'm going to try. I was trying to rush because I see we have 10 minutes left.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I was just mentioning too is teaching individuals to be in closer proximity when necessary to improve their level of accessibility. Well, it's also important for school team members and parents to understand that depending on where the individual's language development is going to depend on how close you really need to get to them and be within their listening bubble. So for example, when they're really little and they're just developing, they're going to have that need for increased accessibility. So it's going to have to be closer. And then you can see as the individual gets older and older, because they have more language and understanding, you can tend to expand that listening bubble. So just keep that in mind. And again, it's just something that we pay attention to, and it's important to calibrate for us at school to support the student, and then also to carry out that same level of support at home and throughout their activities of daily living. All right. So as Pauline was saying, one of the things that we really need to do is really give you parents the opportunity to tell your story. What are your observations, your experiences? And it's a form of self-disclosure, because as a parent, you are definitely probably challenged with addressing communication breakdowns. And it's not just you that may be experiencing those communication breakdowns. Sometimes you may be observing breakdowns between family members or their peers. And then you see that depth of social emotional impact. And then, I know how I am as a parent. When I see that kind of breakdown, it really hits your heart. So again, these are things that we really need to address. Again, because it impacts you, and then whatever we can do to help support you and your child, it also helps to translate how that level of support might be needed at school as well, okay? So there are different types of ways that we can actually incorporate this telling of a story, and the examples here are different types of questionnaires. The questionnaires can not only be asked of you, but also your child. And we start usually when the kids are in elementary school to glean some insight what their perspective is. So an example of one tool that can be used is that if the child themselves is here, and maybe this is when the kids are really little, and we need to glean some insight as to what individuals or what situations, environments that the child is in. And so, for example, if we're just looking at the center family the child would be here, and who would be the immediate people that they would be communicating with. And then giving you the opportunity to talk about, well, what challenges are you as parents experiencing in the communication with your child? That's going to be most critical because you're the critical link to the development of their speech and language. Then we would go to the next ring and maybe we would look at, well, are there any communication breakdowns? Do you have any concerns for the child communicating with, say, grandparents? And an example would be that sometimes family members are not in agreement with the child wearing hearing aids. And a lot of that is due to stigma. And so whatever we can do to address that, that is a main factor that impacts that sense of normalcy in the use of amplification. And whatever we can do to try to mitigate that stigma and help support you and, you know, posing questions and getting people within the family to talk about it with you, and then coming up with resolutions or types of responses that could help facilitate the reduction of the stigma. And again, in turn, that improves the social emotional wellness for you as well as your child. One of the things that we've done in school, this is called My World. This is almost like a game, and it actually is an application that can be added to an iPad. This is when the child can actually walk through, and I've actually had parents sit with me when I'm doing this activity with a child. And sometimes the parents want to step in and say, well, you should. And I'm like, no, 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 no. You have to watch the child walk through this process so that you learn what their experiences are and how they would learn how to modify the situation. So for example, there are 3 different settings. One is school, one is home, and one is outdoors, because the kids are outdoors and they're going to be playing with friends. Recess, you know, again, what are their experiences? What are their perceptions? What kind of communication strategies could they incorporate to rectify those types of problems? As Ms. Heard-Dunn was talking about, environmental strategies, how can they advocate? And then maybe this is how we develop goals and objectives that we can target on the IEP. Okay. Older students, again, pictures are worth 1,000 words. We can display pictures in front of the students because a lot of times the older middle schoolers and high schoolers may be less communicative about what their challenges are. And if we give them pictures to choose from, that they identify what are maybe the 3 top or 4 top situations, and then teaching them to prioritize what is most important for them to address first, second, third, and fourth. Again, here's another way. You know, when I was teaching at Maryland, you know, when we look at dating, you know, what happens when they're dating and, you know, they have a communication breakdown. You know, I used to embarrass the college students when we would talk about that, but it is an important piece, you know, because if they want to date, they're going to have to come up with communication strategies, ability to explain to the other individual what their experiences are as a person living with hearing loss.
I see a question in the chat.
Yep, I was just go right ahead. I was just going to let you know that.
Yeah, I just saw a question in the chat and somebody wanted to know what grade level is My World for?
My World is typically for elementary school.
And there was one more question that said, how do you help students in virtual class to follow conversations when cameras are turned off?
Hopefully they're using the captions and the teachers can also repeat what's being said. But a lot of our students are favoring virtual learning for the reason of using their captions. They can, you know, there's less distractibility, there's no background noise, they can manage the volume, and they're really connecting with the captions. They probably would not have said that a year ago, but since they've had to rely on it this year, they see it's been a lot of benefit for them. But yeah, I would say the teacher, she could repeat what's being said. And also if they're using captions, like do we have ours on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is just a record form. And again, it helps us to help the student record what their responses are, what's the priority, what I would do as the audiologist, what the teacher should do, what a parent should do, and what their role is in it. So again, this is just another way where we can capture in writing for the student and then use this as documentation in their audiology file or service delivery file. It gives us an opportunity to goal share across, the parents, the student, and the audiologist and teacher for the deaf and hard of hearing. And again, sometimes we incorporate some of this into their self-advocacy and self-efficacy goals in the IEP.
And this was the last question I think I had. What percentage of students with hearing loss are educated in the mainstream, do you think? And in the interest of time, I will tell you, 75% of students, deaf students, are educated in the mainstream, some form of mainstream. It could be separate class, or it could be just with itinerant support in their general education class. So 75% are in the mainstream. Of that 75%, 50% are in the general education and not in a special class. So 75% of deaf students are in mainstream education in their school system, but 50% of that number is in the general education and just receiving itinerant support.
So what percentage of learning in children is obtained through incidental learning?
Oh.
Well, it's actually like 90%.
Incidental learning. So that is just, having your ears available for hearing what's coming in, or through the air if it's signing through sign language. But if you're in a hearing family where people are speaking, you're in a oral program at school, then you really have to get that incidental learning, which accounts for most of what children are benefiting from getting their education from. That speaks to the need for having consistent hearing aids and having just the accessibility. So if we're speaking to whenever we're speaking with deaf people around or hard of hearing people around, make sure that they can see you, that what's being spoken is accessible to them. You will hear a lot of deaf people say that even at home, there's a whole conversation at dinner and then they miss part of it. And when they ask what happened, you might get one sentence, so they've missed a lot of that incidental learning. But that accounts for so much language development, literacy. And the last part of those three categories was fitting in, personal identity, community engagement. Starts with family support. So our students, we want them to feel good about themselves, not feel like something's wrong with them always, what's wrong with your hearing? You didn't hear me, So we want them to feel, have a positive sense of self-identity. That includes reading about deaf people in literature, learning about deaf culture, ways to incorporate it. Nowadays, there's movies or TV shows that include deaf people. One way is finding a deaf person or hard of hearing person in the community, somebody who's a peer. And that's one thing I think that as a program, we could probably improve, and we work together